It was supposed to be a routine stop, just another day on the job for officers Blake and Turner, two cops who had spent years patrolling the city's streets, confident in their authority and untouchable in their power. They had done this before: a traffic stop, a few aggressive questions, and a search that wasn't exactly by the book. It was second nature to them. But this time, they had no idea who they were dealing with. The man behind the wheel was calm, too calm. Dressed in a plain hoodie and jeans, he didn't look like anyone special, at least not to them. To Blake and Turner, he was just another guy they could intimidate, another easy target. When they demanded his ID, he handed it over without a word. When they told him to step out of the car, he didn't argue. But something about him felt different. There was no fear in his eyes, no anger, just patience, as if he was waiting for something. That didn't stop them. The moment they found the envelope of cash in his glove compartment, their smirks widened. Well, what do we have here?" Blake chuckled, holding up the money. Turner shook his head, already deciding the man's fate in his mind. "Where'd you get this kind of cash, huh?" he asked, his tone laced with accusation. "This doesn't look legal to me." The man's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. He could have explained. He could have told them exactly who he was. But he wanted to see how far they would take it, how much disrespect they would throw his way before realizing the truth. And so, as they pocketed his money, laughed in his face, and sent him on his way with nothing but humiliation, he let them dig their own graves. Because tomorrow morning, when they walked into the precinct expecting another normal day, they'd be in for the shock of their lives. The man they had robbed and ridiculed wasn't just anybody. He was their new police chief, and he wasn't about to let this slide. The next morning, officers Blake and Turner strolled into the precinct as if nothing had happened. Another day, another shift. They laughed about last night, feeling no guilt, no second thoughts, just easy money, just another guy who wouldn't dare report them. In their minds, it was business as usual. But something was different. The atmosphere in the precinct felt tense. Officers whispered among themselves, exchanging curious glances. Some stood straighter when they walked in, others avoided eye contact. Blake nudged Turner. "What's with them?" he muttered under his breath. Turner shrugged. Probably nothing. Then the captain stepped forward. "Morning, everyone," he announced, his voice steady but carrying an edge. "Before we start, I want you all to welcome our new chief." A hush fell over the room. Every officer turned toward the hallway as footsteps echoed from around the corner. And then he walked in. Blake and Turner's blood ran cold. The man from last night. The man they had humiliated, robbed, and laughed at. He wasn't wearing a hoodie anymore. Now he stood before them in a crisp uniform, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. His presence alone commanded the room, and the air grew heavier with each passing second. He scanned the crowd, his expression unreadable, but when his gaze locked onto Blake and Turner, something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, the faintest trace of amusement. But he said nothing, not yet. Instead, he gave a polite nod to the captain and stepped forward. "Good morning," he said, his voice calm, steady. "I'm Chief Harris. It's an honor to be here." Blake swallowed hard. Turner's hands clenched at his sides. Neither dared to move. Chief Harris continued, his tone as smooth as ever. "I look forward to working with all of you," he said, pausing just long enough to let his words settle. Then, as if speaking directly to them, he added, "and making sure this department operates with integrity. That every officer upholds the law, not just when it's convenient." The message was clear. Blake and Turner felt it in their bones. Their world had just turned upside down. And the worst part, this was only the beginning. As the morning briefing ended, officers clapped politely, but there was an uneasiness in the air. Chief Harris remained composed, professional, but Blake and Turner could feel it. He wasn't going to let last night slide. They kept their heads down, acting as if nothing had happened, but their minds raced with possibilities. Did he tell anyone? Was this some kind of setup? Would he handle it quietly, or was he about to ruin their careers in front of everyone? Blake forced a chuckle as they walked toward their desks. Maybe he doesn't even recognize us, he muttered. But Turner wasn't convinced. Nah, he said, shaking his head. He remembers. He remembers. Meanwhile, Chief Harris settled into his office, closing the door behind him. He leaned against the desk, staring at the city map pinned to the wall. His first day was supposed to be about setting the tone, earning the trust of his officers. Instead, it had turned into something else, something personal. He had spent years rising through the ranks, earning respect through hard work and fairness. But last night reminded him why he had taken this job in the first place. Corruption, abuse of power, it wasn't just a problem in other precincts. It was right here, under his command. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Captain Reynolds stepped in, arms crossed. So, Chief, any first impressions? Harris smirked slightly. A few, he said. He could have told Reynolds everything right then, exposed Blake and Turner for what they had done. But something held him back. He wanted to see what they'd do next. Would they try to cover their tracks? Would they come to him, hoping to talk their way out of it? Or would they keep acting like they were untouchable? Out on patrol, Blake and Turner were restless. "We need a plan," Blake whispered as they drove through the streets. "What if he's just waiting to make a move?" Turner exhaled sharply. "Then we get ahead of it," he said. "We find out what he knows. If we have to, we make sure he keeps his mouth shut." But what they didn't know was that Chief Harris was already a step ahead of them. Blake and Turner could feel the walls closing in. Every glance from another officer felt like suspicion. Every interaction with Chief Harris carried an unspoken weight. They knew they had to act fast, but the problem was, they had no idea what Harris was thinking. Had he told anyone? Was he waiting for the right moment to make a move? Or was he just toying with them, letting the fear eat them alive before dropping the hammer? Turner couldn't shake the paranoia. "We can't just sit here," he muttered as they sat in their patrol car. "What if he's setting us up?" Blake gritted his teeth. "Then we find something on him first. Everyone's got skeletons, right?" His fingers tapped anxiously against the steering wheel. "We just have to make sure he's got something worse than us." Meanwhile, Chief Harris was playing his own game. He had already pulled their records, multiple complaints, all dismissed. Suspicious stops, questionable searches, accusations of intimidation. It wasn't enough to take them down, but it painted a picture, one he couldn't ignore. That afternoon, he decided to push them. He called both officers into his office, keeping his expression unreadable as they stepped inside. The tension was thick. Turner did all the talking, his voice forced and casual. "Something we can do for you, Chief." Harris leaned back in his chair, hands clasped together. "I like to get to know my officers," he said simply. "Understand how they operate, what motivates them." Blake swallowed hard. "We just do our jobs, sir." Harris studied them for a long moment. "I'm sure you do," he said, his tone even. "But I believe in accountability. Transparency. If there's anything that's been overlooked in this department, I plan to fix it." His gaze didn't waver. "I expect my officers to uphold the law. All of them." The message was clear, and Blake and Turner felt the ground beneath them shift. The game was no longer in their control. Harris wasn't going to let this go. As they left the office, Turner's hands clenched into fists. "We have to do something," he whispered. "Now." But what they didn't know was that Harris had already made his move. The trap was set, and they were walking right into it. Blake and Turner knew they were running out of time. Chief Harris wasn't backing down, and the pressure was getting to them. Every passing hour, every shift felt like another step toward disaster. They had to act before he did. But what could they do? He was their boss now. A direct attack wasn't an option, not without consequences. Then, Turner had an idea. "We flipped the script," he said, lowering his voice as they sat in their patrol car. "We make him the problem." Blake frowned. "What do you mean?" Turner smirked. We spread some doubts. He's new, right? No one here really knows him. What if we make it look like he's the one with a past? A little rumor, a little suspicion. It doesn't take much to turn the heat off us. It was risky, but they had no better options. That night, whispers started floating around the precinct. Stories about Harris' past, his sudden rise through the ranks, his transfer to this department. Was there something he was hiding? Had he covered something up to get here? A few officers raised their eyebrows, others shrugged it off, but doubt had been planted. What Blake and Turner didn't know was that Harris had expected this. He had been in law enforcement long enough to recognize desperation when he saw it. But what they really didn't know was that he had been working on something much bigger behind the scenes. The next morning, before either of them could make another move, an internal affairs team walked into the precinct. Officers straightened, eyes shifting between the investigators and Harris, who stood calmly near his office door. Officers Blake and Turner, one of the agents said, stepping forward, "We need to speak with you. Now." Blake felt his stomach drop. "What is this?" he demanded, forcing a laugh. "What's going on?" The agent held up a file. "An ongoing investigation," he said. "Multiple complaints, possible misconduct." Turner's face paled. They had been so focused on Harris that they never saw this asterisk coming. And then, just as the tension hit its peak, Chief Harris finally spoke. "I told you," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Accountability applies to everyone Blake and Turner sat in the interrogation room, their confidence completely shattered. Hours had passed, and the weight of the investigation was pressing down on them like never before. Internal Affairs had files, real evidence. Not just complaints from people they had bullied, but footage, reports, witness statements. Things they thought had been buried were now being laid out in front of them. Every questionable stop, every intimidation tactic, every abuse of power. It was all coming back to haunt them. Turner slammed his fist on the table. "This is a setup," he snapped. "This is him trying to get rid of us." The investigator didn't react. He simply slid a flash drive across the table. "You tell me," he said. Blake hesitated before plugging it into the laptop. The screen flickered, and then their worst nightmare began to play. It was footage from that night, the night they stopped Chief Harris. The entire encounter had been recorded, every word, every action, the smirks, the laughter, the way they had pocketed his money without a second thought. It was all there, clear as day. They hadn't even thought to check if the street cameras had caught them, but Harris had, and he had let them dig their own graves. Blake swallowed hard. This doesn't prove anything," he muttered, but even he knew it was a weak defense. Turner looked like he wanted to run, but there was nowhere left to go. The door opened and Chief Harris walked in. He didn't sit. He didn't need to. He simply crossed his arms and looked at them, his face unreadable. "You thought you had this department under your control," he said quietly. "You thought you could keep playing the same game, hurting the same people, never answering for it." He shook his head. "That ends today." Blake opened his mouth to protest, but Harris wasn't done. He slid another file onto the table. "You're both looking at termination, but if you want to walk out of here in cuffs, keep talking." Silence filled the room. Turner clenched his jaw. Blake looked at the floor. They had lost. And then, just when they thought it couldn't get worse, Harris leaned in slightly and said, "Oh, and by the way, that money you stole, that was a setup too." Blake's head shot up. Harris smirked. "I knew exactly what you'd do. I just needed to see how far you'd go." Their stomachs dropped. It had never been about revenge. It had been about justice. And justice had finally caught up to them. Blake and Turner sat frozen, their minds racing, but there was nothing left to say. They had played their game for years, believing they were untouchable. Now they were just two disgraced officers with nowhere to run. The weight of their actions had finally caught up to them, and Chief Harris had made sure they had no way out. The next morning, the precinct was buzzing. Word spread quickly. Blake and Turner were officially off the force. Officers whispered about what had happened, some in shock, others in quiet approval. A few who had once turned a blind eye to their behavior now pretended they had never been part of it. It was a new day, and things were changing. Chief Harris walked through the station, feeling the shift in the air. This wasn't about just two bad cops. It was about setting a new standard. He had come here for a reason, and now that reason was clear. No one, no matter how long they had been on the job, was above the law. Later that evening, he stepped outside, breathing in the cool night air. He thought back to the moment Blake and Turner had stopped him, the way they had looked at him like he was nothing. That moment could have gone 100 different ways. But patience, strategy, and integrity had won in the end. As he turned to head home, a young officer approached him hesitantly. "Chief," he said, I wanted to say I respect what you did. A lot of us do." Harris nodded, appreciating the words but knowing there was still work to be done. "Good," he said, "because this is just the beginning." The officer straightened, understanding the message. Harris wasn't here to be a figurehead. He was here to make sure justice wasn't just a word on a badge, but a promise lived out every single day. And as he walked away, the precinct behind him standing just a little taller, he knew this was only the start of something bigger, something right.